Hi everybody.
Hello.
So we're back with part 2 of our series on Jesus now. So we're reaching the climax of the story. Remember, we talked about Jesus has come on the scene, and all the gospel writers want to be very clear. He is announcing the new kingdom that God is bringing. The kingdom of God, the rule of heaven is now coming to earth. And Jesus is right at the forefront of that. And he is, if you like, bringing together all the expectations and hopes and longings of the people. And yet, it's not like the people thought at all. So what we're going to do today is just look at, if you like, Jesus and the new Israel, the new people of God, and how Jesus seems to take things and turn them upside down. Okay? What's the kingdom of God like? Who's in it? Who's out of it? How do you act in the kingdom of God? Okay, these are all the things we're going to try and look at in the next 20 minutes or so. Jesus, the true Israel. I think that one of the things that we see when we look at the way the gospel writers want to frame things is to show that Jesus was actually coming and reenacting the story of Israel. Okay, we've already looked at this story in some detail, but you think about it from, we could choose Matthew, I guess. So Matthew presents Jesus in chapter 3. He's getting baptized, coming through the water.
Yeah.
So he comes through the waters and then into the wilderness. 40 days in the wilderness. So just like Israel came out of Egypt, through the waters, and then into the wilderness. Yeah.
Would the people have recognised that similarity?
I think they would have done reading it like this now. You know, when it says he was through the waters and then in the wilderness for 40 days. Something about that 40 would probably speak to them. He goes from there, goes into the temptation, which again they would have been, as the people of Israel, very clear about the temptation in the wilderness and how Israel had failed in that temptation. They hadn't believed God, hadn't been faithful to God, and therefore had not received the promises. But Jesus goes through and is faithful to God. So he's where Israel had failed. We find this new Israel, Jesus, succeeding. So from the temptation, he goes out and we see him very quickly up a mountain, just like Israel, where Moses went up the mountain, and he comes back down to give this list. Remember the law, it says, you know, you're blessed if you're this, blessed if you're that, but cursed are you if you're like this. And so Jesus again starts to teach in that way, redefining the law amongst them.
So do you think they were listening to all, just thinking, oh, that's what we were meant to be like?
I think there'll be some and some.
We were wandering around whining in the desert. And
I think those that are listening don't necessarily know it at the time.
No.
I think the gospel writers are putting it together for us to see it and think, okay, this is what it's about. So they're recognising what Jesus is doing, and they're writing it down in a way for us to read and go, oh, we recognise that from another time.
Okay. Jesus
is now reenacting this. I think when Jesus chose the 12 disciples, that was probably the moment that people there would have thought, he's now doing something to be like Israel.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the 12 sons, the 12 tribes, like the 12 disciples. He chose 12 that would represent him. And I think that at that moment they would have said,
really?
there's something
Why would
going
that
on
be
there.
such a big...
Well, I think 12 is just such a key number for Israel. They're very strong on their identity. You know, this is who we are as the 12 tribes.
Okay.
So I think that would have had a big impact. And certainly when
I wonder what they thought of his choices.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But finally, but another one would be when they're asking him to feed them. He said, Moses gave us manna in the desert.
Yeah.
And he says, listen, I'm the true bread that came from heaven. He's saying, actually, you know, that was just a play. This was just a shadow of the reality, the true bread that was coming. Now, he teaches them all these things as if to say, that was just the shadow, the reality is now. And where Israel failed, I'm going to succeed. Okay? And as you say, who were the people that were being brought in? Who, you know, when this new Israel is being reenacted and the 12 are chosen and then others are gathering into this little band. It's quite interesting when the people of Israel would have thought, well, obviously we know who's in and we know who's out. The people that are in are the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. They're the great holy ones. We all know that.
Ones.
Yeah, and the people that are out, well, we know the people that are out. They're the tax collectors. They're the prostitutes. They're the sinful people. And Jesus seems to turn that on its head. Suddenly, the new people of God that he's leading are this really odd crowd of zealots and tax collectors and fishermen and prostitutes and women with really dodgy histories. And they're all brought together in this group that Jesus is now talking about, this new people of God, with God coming to reign amongst them. You know, it's fascinating. Okay, so Jesus is being shown to be the new Israel, the new, if you like, the Son of God. You know how God said, "Out of Egypt I called my son," called Israel his son, and now there's this new son. And where Israel failed, now Jesus is resisting temptation and succeeding in trusting God. Okay, so the true Israel. Secondly, Jesus is the true temple. Okay, so for the Jews, the temple was the centre of their lives, the centre of the religious life, the centre of their political life. It was where everything happened of any consequence. The temple. This was the place where God could be met. Even though they knew God wasn't really there at that time, they were still hoping God would return. And then Jesus comes and starts talking about himself as the temple. So we talked about it last time. John chapter 1, he says that the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. This one from God came to us as a man and dwelt amongst us. Like the presence of God. The temple was a place where mankind and God could meet. And instead of it being a place, a building, Jesus starts to refer to it being himself.
Yeah.
So we'll look at that.
So you don't need to go to a holy place, he is the holy place.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah. And it's such a big thing for them to get their minds around that. Such a shift. Totally unexpected.
No, it's massive, isn't it? I feel a bit sorry for them, really.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to take in. He says, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And they actually used that against him at his trial, saying, "Oh, he's going to destroy the temple." And he never meant it. He was talking about his body.
No, they must have been outraged.
Yeah. So that's why when he announces forgiveness of sin, you remember some of the Pharisees got very hot under the collar. But the reason he did it, the reason they were so shocked by it, is because nobody could forgive sin outside of the temple. Jesus was kind of taking the temple to people and announcing forgiveness of sin. It's like, how can he announce forgiveness of sin? That's only for God to do in the temple. That's our job, to kind of go in between people and to get them forgiven. And now Jesus is going and doing it outside the temple. The temple was on the move. Do you remember there was a celebration, one of the feasts, the Feast of Tabernacles, where they celebrate this great river of Ezekiel 47 coming out of the temple.
Yeah.
And they're trusting that one day this river will start to flow out from the temple to the nations. And Jesus, right in the middle of that celebration, stands up in a loud voice and says, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." It's like, who do you think you are? He's the temple. That's how he saw himself. The true temple coming to the people. Okay, another great part of the Jewish understanding of their identity was the Sabbath. The rhythms of the Sabbath, of 7-day rest, of making sure that they kept that before God as a way of marking themselves out as different from all the other people. It was unusual. No other group of people did that, the Sabbath. And yet Jesus actually seems to cause trouble on the Sabbath. I don't know if you're aware of this, how much trouble he causes on the Sabbath.
It's like he does it on purpose.
Yeah, he does. From time to time, I really think he did.
He provokes them.
Yeah. Because he wants them to understand that the true Sabbath is amongst them. It's not just a certain sacred time. It's actually him coming to them. So he says, all you who are weary, who are heavy laden, who are burdened down with your religion and stuff like that, he says, come to me and I will give you rest. He is the rest. Not the Sabbath time, but he himself is the rest. And I always find it interesting when you see the number of healing miracles that Jesus did on the Sabbath. And it's a bit like, how he announces this year of Jubilee, which is all about Sabbath. It's about 70 or 7 times the 7th year. It's the 49th year is the year of Jubilee, and debts are repaid and slaves are set free and all these kind of things. And he says, actually, this is happening now. Freedom, liberation for the captives, healing for the sick is happening now through me. And he constantly heals on the Sabbath. And they say, you can't heal. You shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath. Heal on the other days. And he says, actually, this is a sign of who I am, the true Sabbath, the true freedom bringer. That's what Sabbath is really about, freedom. And this was Jesus coming to set captives free. Jesus is the true Israel. He's the true temple. And he's the true Sabbath. And finally, I want to talk about him being the true law. Okay? Lots of people misunderstand Jesus when they read him in the Sermon on the Mount. He says this, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And he goes on to say, so we should actually teach and we should keep hold of the commandments, which confuses people. Because they say, should we keep the law or are we free from the law? Should we be keeping the law of Moses or not? The food laws, the sacrificial laws, the moral laws, all these kind of things. And just want to explain this because it's important in our overall theme. So Jesus says, I haven't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. Okay, let's start with the prophets. So, what does it mean for Jesus to say, I've not come to abolish the prophets, but to fulfill them? What do you think that means?
Well, he's not cancelling them out, he's shedding more light on it.
Yeah, excellent. So what he's saying is, listen, with regards to the prophets, you would never have known what all the prophecies really meant until I came on the scene and showed you. So how would you have known what even something like Isaiah 53, the classic prophecy of Jesus on the cross?
Yeah.
How would we have known what that would look like? We couldn't have really known it or understood it fully. We'd have known something about it, but we couldn't see it properly until Jesus was there on the cross. And now we suddenly realise what he's doing, and it makes sense. Isaiah 53 makes sense when we see Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
And that's the same for all the prophecies about Jesus. We couldn't really understand them fully until we saw them fulfilled in Jesus. Okay, so if that's true, and that's a bit more easy to understand, let's talk about it from the law's point of view. How did we know what the law was really trying to bring us? Well, Jesus says, I haven't come to abolish it, I've come to fulfill it. In other words, just like we could only understand the prophecies when we looked at Jesus, so also we could only understand the law when we see it in Jesus. And that's really what he's trying to say. That everything that we read about in the law, we can only see a glimpse of the heart of God in it. We see it as a shadow. But when we see it in Jesus, we say, oh, that's what it looks like. That's what it's really all about.
Why are theologians still debating it so much then if it's that simple?
Because I think they don't follow this through very well. I honestly think this is true. Because he then goes on to redefine the law.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I tell you, he's reshaping what the guys have read for years and years. He says, I've not come to abolish this. I've come to show you what it really means. So it's not about adultery. It's about lust in the heart.
Mm.
It's not about murder. It's about your own anger, dealing with unforgiveness. All these things that we've been reading about and thinking we understood. Jesus says, no, I've come to reshape it and to show you what it really means.
Yeah.
And this is the life in the kingdom of God. And he goes through to teach in the Sermon on the Mount this life that's full of generosity, that's full of forgiveness, that's full of kindness to your enemies. This is the life of the kingdom that the law and the prophets have been pointing to, even though they didn't actually show it that clearly. Only in Jesus can we see it clearly. So are we under the law of Moses? No. We just realise that the law of Moses points us in the direction of this life that Jesus modelled, that is the life of the kingdom, that is far greater in its righteousness than what the law could produce. Jesus is the true law. That make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, so here's the question to discuss for today. Why do you think Jesus stirred up so much hatred from all the religious rulers of his day? And that we want to discuss this week. Okay, thanks for listening, guys. Talk to you again soon.
Bye.
Bye.